to the Wine Nirvana podcast. Wine reviews for the average wine drinker. No pretense, no snobbery, no numerical ratings. And here's our host, Stephen Hawk.
Hello, seekers of knowledge and truth about wine. Yes, it is Stephen Hawk, your wine guru. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Wine Nirvana podcast. And today is a very special episode because we have our very first guest. It is Mr. Pat Helmers. Pat Helmers is an engineer, a salesman, a sales trainer, a podcaster himself, a business development coach, a raconteur, a husband and a father of 4 grown men, which I think is an amazing accomplishment just there. So, Pat, welcome to Wine Nirvana.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. I really appreciate it.
It's long seemed to me that there's a number of things in the food world that although you can make them yourself, you just don't really need to, either because of a lack of training or equipment or both. And I would include in that sushi, baklava, which is a puff pastry dessert from Turkey and Greece, croissants, and germane to our discussion, beer and wine. But I know that you have made your own beer for a long time. So, what compelled you to get into DIY beer?
Awesome question. Back in the day, when I was an engineer, I had to travel to London for work. And when I got there, they had extra special bitters and pale ales and porters and ESBs. These are all beers I just absolutely fell in love with. And I remember buying them in bottles and bringing them on the plane. You could do that back in the day. And I'm like, oh, I need to buy these here in the States. And in those days, it was Budweiser, it was Miller. You couldn't even get Coors back in those days.
No, I remember that. I remember Paul Newman was an early champion of Coors, and it was very much regional to the Colorado area.
Yeah, in fact, they did a whole movie on, I think, Burt Reynolds, right? Smokey and the Bandit kind of things, where they were bringing it in like they were selling cigarettes without stamps on them and things like that. But I knew some guys at where I worked at back in the day. I worked for Bell Laboratories, and it was filled with really smart, nerdy engineers. And these guys were brewing their own beer. And they actually had a club, a homebrew club. So I brewed my first beer like in the mid-'80s. And it was pretty medieval how we did it back in those days. But I remember the very first batch that I brewed was with a can of malt called John Bull. It came from England. It had the hops already in it, and all you had to do was pour it in, toss the yeast, add 4 gallons of water, and in 5 days you had beer. Then you put it in a bottle, and from then on, I have brewed all kinds of beers ever since. There was a couple, 2-3 years in there where I don't think I brewed anything at all. Life got really busy raising kids. But I still brew beer. I don't have anything going right now. But it's been just an incredibly enjoyable experience. And it's given me an appreciation for the beer that I drink. Like you said, it's for you, beer is just something, isn't it just easier to buy it than to make it? You don't know what it's like, what goes into it, and you really appreciate it more thoroughly when you've made it yourself. Just like musicians appreciate music in a way that people who don't have a played instrument can't.
I find it interesting that you have pursued it because, of course, in the ensuing 35 years, the beer scene has just changed remarkably, as you well know. You can go to your liquor store and you'll see a 12-foot long shelves filled with craft beers. And so a lot of this stuff that was completely unavailable is now readily available. But I get the personal satisfaction and the sort of the in-depth involvement of that. Where do you now source your ingredients and supplies?
I've gotten them all over the place through the years. Homebrew stores have opened and closed since then. But currently right now, I purchased them in St. Charles, Illinois. There's a homebrew store up there. I also got them online. There's an awesome place called Wine and Hops in Madison, Wisconsin. They sell, this is pretty clever, they sell you a whole box, and everything you need's in the box. All the different grains already pre-measured out. It's kind of like buying a cake mix.
Well, that certainly makes it convenient.
And the beer is just absolutely astounding. Yeah, it's just really, really great. Last winter, I finally broke down and bought a kegging system.
So what would that be?
Called a corny keg. It's the same kegs that were similarly used for soda and pop. They hold about 5 gallons. It's got a CO2 bottle you connect to it, and it's got a party tapper on there. There's nothing like draft beer. Oh. And the only downside is you're like drinking it like all the time.
Yeah. You classify that as a downside? I don't understand it. Now, apparently, you've also become a hop farmer, which seems quite ambitious.
It's not really. Yeah, I planted hops maybe 5-6 years ago. I did Haller Towers, I did some Fuggles, and I did some Cascades. And Haller Towers are from Germany, Fuggles are from England, and Cascades are famously from Oregon. Only the Cascades survived. They're the other ones that made it. But they are doing extremely well, and I had a huge crop this year. I had like 5 or 6 strains of them. I don't know if you know much about hops, but it's kind of like a vine, and on the vine are these flowers, which are hops. They're like little cones. And what I do is they're maybe 2, 3, 4 yards away from my house, and I have a string connected to the eave of the house, and they grow up that string. And then harvest them, you go up at the top and you just cut those off. I can actually reach in my window, and then they fall down, and then you pick them, and then you dry them. And I got a nice big bag full of them this year, and they're all dried out, and they're in my refrigerator, and they're ready to go.
So with homebrew supplies now readily available, why did you decide to grow your own hops?
Just to see if you could. Now you might think, well, so Pat, are you looking to start growing barley next?
No, there is a limit.
I have played with yeast some. I have collected yeast from previous beers and cultured it and reused it for other beers. I have done that.
Now, it's interesting you mention yeasts because, with the pandemic, a lot of people have turned to baking at home, particularly sourdough, and there's a whole subculture that eschews commercial yeast in favor of wild yeast. And that is pretty fascinating. I've dabbled in that myself, and you can add water to commercial flour, put it in a mason jar for a week, and the natural yeast that clings to that flour will start to propagate. It's really kind of amazing.
I tried that, and it didn't turn out that great. But it goes down this whole path, and this is something I'm really interested in, this whole fermentation task.
Fermentation in general, right.
Which is why I would like to get better at this. I'm very interested in fermentation. Like, I would like to do kombucha. I would like to do the Korean sauerkraut. Kimchi.
You've done wine as well, which I think is even more ambitious than beer on many levels. For one thing, you don't have access to a vineyard, and people go to UC Davis and they spend 4 years studying how to make wine, and then a lifetime in the fields. So wine is readily available. So beyond your general interest in fermentation, what drew you to winemaking?
Some friends of mine had made some wine, and they'd brought a bottle over, and I was blown away by the quality of it. Just blown away. It was really fresh. It was a Super Tuscan from Italy, and it was bold and beautiful. It was bright and velvety at the same time. It was very complex. It was super fun. So they turned us on to them, and we've done 4 wines. And I get those from Northern Brewers. I get those online.
So what is it you're buying from Northern?
So you grapes, grape juice. And then often give you, and it depends on the wine, the style, but they also give you grape skins, some preservatives, some sulfur, some sulfurs, various things like oak chips.
Oh, yes, right, because you don't have a barrel.
Don't have a barrel, but a square chunk of oak has a lot of dimensions to it. And if you put 2-3 dozen of those in there, it makes a huge difference.
Well, it does. And that's not a trick limited to people who make wine at home. There are smaller commercial wineries will often go that route as well. I know there's a winery in Door County, Wisconsin called Simon Creek, and they have no barrels. They've been in business for about 15 years and have never invested in a barrel program and just rely on their steel tanks and wood chips, and actually to good effect. So even some small commercial producers go the wood chip route.
Yep, that certainly works. It certainly works. My son actually took some very cheap whiskey and put oak chips in it, charred oak chips in it, and he put some oak chips with bacon in. And the one with just the plain oak chips was just phenomenal. It didn't really make a difference. And he had done it the old-fashioned way of aging it over years, but you do it the fast way. You put it in the refrigerator for a weekend, then you pull it outside for the week, and then you put it back in the refrigerator, and you bring it back out to room temperature, and you repeat that 3 weeks in a row. And
it mimics the change of season.
It does indeed, yep.
So apparently you also have an interest in distilling, so it seems like you're kind of working up the alcohol ladder.
Yeah, but I haven't really distilled for real. I made Applejack, which uses a process of freezing a hard apple cider, and you pour off the water. And you do that over and over again, and eventually all you have left is alcohol.
So you can extract the alcohol without an actual still.
Yeah. What's interesting about Applejack, though, is because you're not cooking off a lot of these alcohols, ethylenes and methanes, and I don't know what all. If you drink a lot of it, you can get quite the hangover, I guess.
So caution is advised.
I want to really distill someday. I don't think it's very hard from what I'm reading. There's not a lot of science to it. You just heat it up, and the alcohol condenses on something like a cold coil. It doesn't have to be that. It could be anything. And then it just drips off the condenser, and that's how you collect the alcohol. You have to look at the temperatures very carefully. When you're brewing beer, when you're mashing, when you're actually extracting, you're actually taking the malt and you're cooking the sugars out of it. There's chemistry behind it that at different temperatures you can optimize how much sugar gets extracted. But that's the thing about making wine is there's no heating. It's actually pretty simple. You just got to dump the grapes in, dump in the yeast, maybe some of these additives, and you're done for a day. You're done.
And just wait a couple of weeks, and away you go.
And you keep adding. Commonly with wine, you add things like the first a couple of weeks, and then the third or fourth week, and then you have to wait a few months before you bottle. And actually, I've really noticed there is a big difference that aging makes a huge difference with wine. For beer, that's not the case. As soon as you make a beer, you can drink it immediately if you can get it
carbonated. Yeah. Yeah, with beer, really, the fresher the better. So, do you have any general life lessons that you've taken from home brewing and winemaking?
Yes. There's a guy named Charlie Papazan, literally wrote the book called The Joy of Homebrewing back in the early 80s, maybe, like 81. He probably started in the 70s. And it's fun if you can find a copy of that book because everybody's dressed up pretty goofy looking. But he taught me a lot of my brewing skills in his book. And he had a quote that sticks in my head for many things in my life. And the quote is this: relax, don't worry, have a home brew.
Words to live by.
You think it's going to screw up? Relax, don't worry. This is going to work out. Okay, maybe it's not going to be perfect, but look, this is not worth stressing over. And he says this throughout the book. He goes, so if you don't wash it quite right, if you don't cook it quite right, look, it's more like baking. Brewing is more like baking than more like cooking. If I'm stir frying, I just throw crap in there, and we're going to do a Thai. Then we put these recipes in. We're going to do a Szechuan. We put these inputs in. when it comes to beer, it's much more organized. But even then, if you muck it up, you're still going to have the beer that shows up.
You still have beer. So I take it you would encourage other people to get into this.
Absolutely.
Well, once again, Pat, thank you so much for joining me.
This has been fun.
All right, that is it for today's episode. I've got to go drink some wine.
This has been Wine Nirvana. To learn more, visit us at www.winenirvana.com.
This is a production of Habanero